You can't charge for what was never yours. He's not luggage. He's my partner.
They thought they could charge him for what was never theirs to claim. They thought his uniform and his quiet eyes made him easy to break. But they didn't know the bond between a Navy SEAL and his service dog. And they didn't know what that bond could wake in the hearts of those who watched. They tried to charge a Navy SEAL for his service dog. But 7 minutes later, the hotel was shut down. Subscribe to Endless Stories and share this video if you believe that true loyalty doesn't need a price tag. And that sometimes, it's the quietest voices that carry the loudest echoes. The hotel lobby was all polished marble and stale grandeur. The kind of place that spoke in low murmurs and half-hidden glances. Jake Evans stood at the reception desk, his broad frame relaxed but his eyes sharp, every line of his posture honed by years of quiet watchfulness. At his side, Bear sat obediently, his black coat glossy under the dim light, his eyes tracking every movement in the room. The receptionist's name tag read Carly, and she wore her smile like armor. Polite, practiced, and unyielding. She barely looked at Jake as she tapped away at her computer, her red nails clacking in the stillness. "Sir," she said, her tone sweet but clipped, "I'm afraid there's an additional charge for the dog." Jake's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "He's not a dog," he said quietly. "He's a service animal. Federal law says you can't charge extra for that." Carly's fingers paused over the keyboard, but only for a moment. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, the smile never reaching her eyes. "Company policy." Jake's hand rested on Bear's head, his fingers curling into the thick fur. Bear didn't move, didn't so much as twitch an ear. He'd been trained for moments like this, moments where calm mattered more than anything else. "I understand company policy," Jake said evenly. "I also understand federal law. My dog goes where I go. No exceptions." Carly's smile wavered, just for a second. She looked at Jake as if she were seeing him for the first time. Not just a guest, but something harder, older, something that wouldn't back down. But then she straightened, her shoulders stiff. "I'm afraid if you can't pay the fee, sir, you'll have to find accommodations elsewhere." The words fell into the quiet lobby like stones. Around them, the muted conversations of the other guests faltered, curiosity and discomfort hanging heavy in the air. Jake didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward or make a scene. He just looked at her the way he'd looked at countless obstacles before, from mountain ridges in Afghanistan to the silent, watchful night of a combat zone. And then he turned away, his hands still resting on Bear's head, his movements calm and deliberate. "Come on, Bear," he said softly. And together, they walked out of the lobby, the quiet swish of the dog's tail the only sound in the hush that followed them. Outside, the wind bit at Jake's face, but he barely felt it. He paused at the top of the steps, one hand resting on Bear's head, the other clenching and unclenching at his side. The quiet fury in his chest was nothing new. It had been his companion as long as he could remember. But this wasn't a battlefield. Or maybe it was. He'd learned long ago that the lines weren't always clear. Bear leaned against his leg, a silent anchor. Jake took a breath, steadying the racing of his thoughts. He didn't mind paying for a room. He didn't mind following the rules. But he wouldn't let anyone put a price on the bond he shared with Bear. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number he'd saved but never thought he'd have to use. It rang twice before a voice answered. A voice that always carried the quiet weight of command. "Evans," the man on the other end said. "What's going on?" Jake explained in clipped sentences, no emotion, just facts. The hotel, the receptionist, the demand for payment for Bear. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then a quiet breath. "Where are you?" the voice asked. Jake told him, his words steady. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about what's right." "I know," the voice said. "Stay there." He hung up and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his hand resting on Bear's back. Around him, the city moved on. Cars hissed by on wet pavement. People hurried past with heads down against the cold. But Jake stood still, the calm in the center of the storm. 7 minutes later, he heard the low rumble of engines. A convoy of dark SUVs turned the corner, moving with a quiet purpose that drew every eye on the block. The doors swung open, and a handful of men in dress blues stepped out. Marines, their uniforms crisp and their expressions hard. The leader was a tall man with close-cropped hair and a voice that carried even when he spoke softly. He walked up the steps, his eyes locking with Jake's. "Sergeant Evans," he said. "We heard there was an issue." Jake nodded once. "There was," he said, "but I won't let it stand." The Marine looked past Jake, his eyes moving over the building's facade, the cold glow of the sign above the door. "Understood," he said quietly. And then he turned, his voice low but clear as he spoke to the men behind him. "Secure the perimeter," he said. "This place doesn't open again until it understands what respect means." The Marines moved with quiet efficiency, their steps sure, their faces calm. They spoke to the hotel manager, to the staff, their words soft but heavy with the weight of something that couldn't be argued with. In minutes, the doors were locked, the lights dimmed, the hotel shuddered, its silence more powerful than any shout. Jake stood with Bear at his side, watching. He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He just stood there, his hand resting on the dog's head, the quiet understanding in his eyes. The Marine leader turned back to him, his mouth set in a grim line. "No one charges a warrior for his brother," he said. "Not while we're still standing." Jake nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you," he said quietly. The Marine gave a small, respectful nod. "You don't need to thank us," he said. "This is what we stand for." And in that small, cold moment, with the hotel behind him and the quiet strength of the Marines beside him, Jake knew he wasn't alone. He knew that loyalty didn't end on the battlefield. It didn't end in uniform. It lived in every quiet moment, every small stand, every choice to see what others tried to ignore. He looked down at Bear, the dog's dark eyes calm and steady. "Come on, buddy," he said softly. "Let's go home." And together, they walked away from the shuttered hotel, their steps quiet but sure. Proof that some bonds can't be priced, and some fights don't need a single word to be won. The air was sharp as Jake and Bear walked away from the shuttered hotel, the low murmur of traffic and the hush of the city evening wrapping around them. Jake kept his head up, each breath steady, each step sure. Bear walked at his side, tail low and calm, every muscle attuned to the rhythm of his partner's quiet determination. Jake didn't think of what had just happened as a victory. He wasn't interested in victories anymore, not the kind measured in applause or headlines. All he wanted was what he'd always fought for. A simple respect that asked nothing more than to see the quiet dignity of those who'd given everything. He didn't know that even as he walked away, the story was already spreading, carried by those who'd watched in the lobby, the whispered echoes of cell phone videos and hushed conversations that traveled further than any battle cry. A small moment, a small stand, but one that reminded people of something they'd almost forgotten. A few blocks away, he stopped at a small diner. Bear sat patiently outside, his head turning to follow every movement in the window. Jake ordered a coffee, his fingers wrapped around the warm cup as he watched the snow begin to fall in slow, deliberate spirals. The waitress, a young woman with kind eyes, noticed Bear through the glass. "He's a beautiful dog," she said, setting the cup down in front of Jake. "Service dog, right?" Jake nodded. "My partner," he said softly. She smiled, genuine and warm. "Good," she said. "We've got a warm place for both of you if you need it." Jake met her gaze, his own expression easing. "Thank you," he said, "but we're okay." As he sat there, he pulled out his phone. Messages were already waiting. Old friends, brothers in arms, people he hadn't heard from in years. A simple text from one of them stood out. "Saw what you did. Semper Fi." He let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders easing. Bear pressed his head against Jake's knee, a silent reassurance. Jake scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the steady weight of that loyalty. An unspoken bond that didn't care about medals or headlines, just the quiet promise to stand beside each other no matter what. Later, when he stepped back outside, the city felt different. Quieter. More honest. He paused to look up at the sky, the snowflakes catching the streetlights like tiny, silent miracles. Bear looked up at him, waiting for the next step, the next quiet battle. And Jake knew, with a certainty that ran deeper than words, that what mattered wasn't the fight he'd just won. It was the way that small stand would ripple out, touching lives he'd never even see, reminding people that respect couldn't be bought, that loyalty couldn't be billed like a hotel fee. He gave Bear a small nod, and together, they stepped into the winter night, each footstep a quiet echo of a stand that would live on long after the snow had melted. By the next morning, the video of what had happened at the hotel had gone viral. It was everywhere, shared in group chats, reposted on news pages, sent around like a quiet battle cry. Jake didn't care about the views, the likes, the endless opinions. All he cared about was that the truth was out there. Bear was not a pet, not a luxury, but a part of him, of every mission, every memory, every breath he'd ever fought to protect. He woke early, the soft rise and fall of Bear's breathing the only sound in the dim light of his small apartment. He poured a cup of coffee, his movements slow and deliberate, each motion a ritual of calm. Outside, the city was waking up, but for Jake, it was still and silent, the way he liked it. His phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message from someone he didn't recognize. He hesitated, then opened it. "I was there. I saw what happened. Thank you for standing up for all of us." Just one sentence. No name, no fanfare. But Jake read it twice, then again, feeling the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. He finished his coffee and took Bear for a walk through the quiet streets. The dog moved beside him with an easy confidence, every step a reminder of the years they'd spent side by side. As they passed a small park, a young man in a worn army jacket lifted his hand in a quiet salute. Jake nodded back, the exchange silent but clear. When they got home, he found another message waiting. This one was from a woman named Elise, someone who worked with veterans and service dogs across the city. She asked if he would come by the center, maybe share some of what had happened, maybe just be there. Jake wasn't sure what he could offer, but he knew one thing. If his quiet stand could help even one other veteran, it was worth everything. That afternoon, he and Bear walked into the center. It was a small building, warm and bustling with life. Veterans talking softly, dogs sleeping in patches of sun, volunteers moving with a quiet purpose. Elise met them at the door, her smile wide and sincere. "Jake," she said, her voice gentle. "We're glad you're here." He nodded, Bear leaning into his leg. "We're glad to be here." They spent the afternoon with the others, listening, sharing, just being. No speeches, no grand declarations. Just the quiet comfort of people who understood. Bear settled at Jake's feet, his eyes half-lidded but always alert. And as Jake talked with the other veterans, about dogs, about duty, about the small ways you find your way home, he realized he wasn't just telling a story. He was healing, too. When he left, Elise stopped him at the door. She pressed a small card into his hand, her eyes kind. "If you ever need a place to talk," she said, "you have one here." Jake looked at the card, then at her. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it. That night, as he sat on his small couch with Bear's head resting in his lap, he felt a quiet peace he hadn't known he'd been searching for. The world outside still hummed with noise, with opinions, with all the things that didn't matter. But in that quiet apartment, it was just him and Bear, and the knowledge that he hadn't stood alone. And that, he realized, was the only thank you he'd ever needed. The next few days passed in a kind of gentle rhythm. Jake didn't seek out the attention that the video had brought. He didn't need to. All he needed was what he'd always had. The quiet partnership with Bear, the steady beat of each breath, each step, each silent promise they shared. He still took long walks through the city every morning, the cold air bracing, the early light painting the world in soft gold. Bear moved easily beside him, his black coat a dark streak against the white snow. People noticed them more now, some with quiet nods of respect, some with cautious smiles. Jake accepted them all with the same calm he carried in every part of his life. One morning, he paused at the corner of a small bakery, the warm smell of bread drifting out into the street. An older woman stepped outside, her eyes bright and curious as she looked down at Bear. "He's beautiful," she said softly, her voice trembling just a little. "I saw the video, what they tried to do to you. Thank you for not backing down." Jake offered her a small smile. "I couldn't," he said simply. "He's part of me." She nodded, her hands wrapped around a paper bag still warm from the oven. "I lost my husband in Vietnam," she said quietly. I know how much those quiet promises mean." Jake didn't say anything. He just reached down, his fingers brushing Bear's head, the silent agreement in that touch stronger than any words. She slipped a small loaf of bread into his hands. "For you both," she said. "Stay strong." Jake took it, his heart tightening. "Thank you," he said. Later that day, he visited the Veterans Center again. He didn't speak much, he never did. But he listened. He listened to the men and women who had walked the same long, quiet roads he had. He listened to their stories, their laughter, the way their voices softened when they talked about the dogs who had carried them through the worst of it. Bear lay at his feet, his breathing slow and even. Every now and then, he would lift his head, his dark eyes calm and watchful. And Jake knew that even in the silence, they were part of something bigger than themselves. As he left the center that evening, he stopped to look back at the building. The light spilling out of the windows was warm and steady, a small beacon in the winter night. He thought of how easily the world had tried to put a price on that kind of loyalty, and he felt a quiet anger stir in his chest. But it wasn't the kind of anger that burned fast and bright. It was something deeper, something that had been forged in every moment of service, every breath that said, "I will not let this go." He turned back toward home, Bear's leash loose in his hand. The snow fell around them in soft, silent drifts, and Jake walked with the kind of calm that only comes when you know who you are and who you'll stand for. And somewhere behind the stillness of his steps, he felt the echo of that day in the hotel. The way the Marines had moved, sure, silent, certain. The way respect didn't need to shout to be heard. In the hush of the night, with Bear at his side and the city quiet around him, Jake knew this. They could try to charge him for his dog. They could try to make him feel small. But they would never take away the quiet strength of the bond he carried with every breath. And that, he thought with a small, steady smile, was the only victory that mattered. A week later, Jake found himself back at the Veterans Center, Bear at his side as always. The small building was warm against the winter cold, the scent of coffee and old wood wrapping around them like a quiet promise. He liked it there, the way no one had to say anything for the air to feel full of understanding. Tom was there, leaning against the counter, his easy grin softening the hard lines of his face. "Jake," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Good to see you." Jake nodded. "You too." Tom pushed a cup of coffee across the counter, the steam curling into the air. "There's a meeting tonight," he said. "A few of the younger guys are coming in. They're struggling. Thought maybe you could sit with them." Jake hesitated. He wasn't sure he had anything to offer but the quiet weight of his own presence. But then he looked down at Bear, the dog's calm gaze steady and sure, and he knew that sometimes that was enough. "I'll be there," he said quietly. That night, he sat in the small circle of chairs, the low light catching on the scuffed floorboards and the worn faces of the men and women who had come looking for something they couldn't name. He didn't say much, just listened, just let the silence between their words feel like something solid, something safe. One of the younger veterans, a kid named Matt, shifted in his chair, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. "I don't know how to be out there," he said, his voice tight. "Feels like no one sees me, like they'll never understand what I've been through." Jake leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "They might not," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean what you've been through doesn't matter." Matt looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "How do you keep going?" he asked. "When it feels like the world just doesn't care?" Jake was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on Bear's back. The dog didn't move, his steady breath a quiet anchor in the room. "You find the ones who do care," Jake said finally, "and you let that be enough." Around them, the room was still. No one spoke, but in the hush, something shifted. The weight of the air softening, the hard lines of Matt's shoulders easing just a little. Later, as he left the center, Jake paused at the door. The snow was falling again, a soft hush against the pavement. He looked back at the room. The quiet conversations, the slow, steady rebuilding of something that had once been broken, and he felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. Outside, a reporter waited, her camera crew huddled against the cold. "Mr. Evans," she called softly as he stepped out. "Do you have a moment?" Jake's jaw tightened. He didn't want the spotlight, but he also knew the story was bigger than him. "What do you want to know?" he asked. The reporter hesitated. "People want to understand what happened that day at the hotel," she said. "Why you stood up for your dog." Jake looked down at Bear, the dog's eyes calm and patient. Then he looked back at her, his voice quiet but unyielding. "Because he's not just a dog," he said. "He's part of me. You don't put a price on that." The reporter swallowed, her eyes soft. "And what would you say to the people who don't understand?" Jake's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "I'd say they don't have to," he said. "We didn't do it for them." He turned away then, his hand resting on Bear's head. The soft rise and fall of the dog's breath, a steady rhythm beneath his fingers. And as he walked away from the camera, from the questions, from the world that would never truly understand, he knew he didn't need them to, because he had Bear. He had the quiet strength of those who had stood beside him. And he had the knowledge that sometimes, the truest battles are the ones you fight with nothing but your own steady breath, and the unwavering loyalty of the one who will always be at your side. The next few days brought a quiet kind of peace. Jake fell back into the rhythm he'd always known. Early mornings, long walks with Bear, the gentle hush of a city that never truly slept. But something in him had shifted. It wasn't that the fight was over. Fights like this never really ended. It was that he'd found a place to stand, a place to be seen. The Veterans Center became a second home, its worn floors and warm lights a balm for the places in him that still ached. Every time he pushed open that door, he felt the same small lift in his chest, like a breath he hadn't known he was holding. One afternoon, Tom found him in the corner of the main room, Bear's head resting in his lap as he listened to another veteran tell his story. Tom sat down beside him, his expression thoughtful. "You've got a way of listening," he said quietly. "Not everyone can do that." Jake shrugged. "I figure most people don't need you to fix it," he said. "They just need to know someone's there." Tom smiled. "Yeah," he said. "You're good at that." Jake didn't know how to answer that. He'd never thought of himself as good at anything but surviving. But he was starting to see that maybe that was enough. That evening, as he walked home with Bear at his side, he passed the shuttered hotel. The lights were off, the sign in the window still a silent testament to the day it all changed. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on Bear's head. "Come on, buddy," he murmured. "We've got better places to be." The snow crunched softly under their boots as they walked on. The city was quiet around them, the world hushed in the slow drift of winter. But in that quiet, there was something else, something steady and sure. When they reached his small apartment, Jake unlocked the door and stepped inside. The heat wrapped around them, the soft light of the lamp in the corner turning the room into a small haven. He knelt to unclip Bear's harness, his hand lingering on the dog's neck. "You're a good boy," he said softly. "Always have been." Bear nuzzled his shoulder, a soft rumble of contentment in his chest. Jake smiled, the lines around his eyes easing. That night, he sat with a mug of coffee, the warmth seeping into his hands as he stared out at the snow. He thought of the reporter's questions, the way the world had tried to understand what he'd done. He thought of the young men and women at the center, the quiet weight of their stories. And he thought of the moment in the hotel lobby, the way his refusal to pay for Bear had become something bigger than just him. A small act that had rippled out in ways he could never have predicted. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this. He would meet it with Bear at his side, his heart steady in his chest. He would meet it with the quiet certainty of a man who knew where he stood, and who he stood with. In the hush of the night, with Bear's head resting on his feet and the world beyond the window wrapped in snow, Jake let out a slow breath. He was home, and that was enough. The world didn't stop because of what happened in that hotel lobby, but it shifted just a little. Jake saw it in small ways, in the way people paused to look a little longer when they passed him and Bear, in the way some would nod with a quiet respect he'd grown to understand. One morning, as he was pouring coffee at the Veterans Center, Rachel approached him with a small, excited smile. "Jake," she said, "there's someone here to see you." He turned, and his breath caught just a little. Standing in the doorway was an older man in a battered leather jacket, his hair silver and his eyes steady and bright. In his hands he held a small wooden plaque, polished to a deep shine. "You're Jake Evans?" the man said. Jake nodded. "Yes, sir." The man stepped forward, holding out the plaque. "I'm the father of a Marine," he said. "My son saw what you did. He told me that sometimes the quietest fights are the ones that matter most." Jake took the plaque in his hands, feeling the weight of it. Not heavy, but solid. On it were just a few words, carved in deep, even lines. "Loyalty knows no price." For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you," he said softly. The man smiled. "No," he said. "Thank you." Jake hung the plaque on the wall of the Veterans Center, where the light from the window caught it in the afternoons. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. But it was a reminder that what he'd done wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who'd ever had to stand their ground for something that mattered. That afternoon, the center was busy, voices weaving through the warm air like a tapestry of memory and laughter. Jake sat with Bear at his feet, listening as a young woman told a story about the dog who had carried her through nightmares she still couldn't name. Her voice was quiet, but her hands were steady, and when she finished, Jake just nodded. The kind of nod that said, "I hear you. I'm here." Later, as he walked home through the crisp winter air, Jake found himself thinking about the hotel again. Not with anger, not even with regret, but with a kind of calm certainty that had taken root in his bones. What he'd done wasn't about making noise or demanding attention. It was about drawing a line and holding it, the same way he'd done 100 times before, in places that didn't make the news. The snow was falling again, soft and silent, each flake a small miracle of patience. Bear pressed close to his leg, his breath misting in the cold. Jake looked down at him, the dog's dark eyes reflecting the light from the street lamps. "Almost home, buddy," he murmured. Bear's tail thumped once, the quiet rhythm of a promise they'd made 1,000 times. At home, he set his boots by the door, the warmth of the small apartment a balm after the cold. He hung his coat on the hook, his hand lingering for a moment on the fabric. It was a small gesture, but it felt like closing the door on something that had been left open too long. As he settled onto the couch, Bear curled up beside him, his head resting on Jake's thigh. Jake ran his fingers through the dog's fur, the steady weight of it grounding him in a way nothing else could. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew that whatever it was, he'd meet it the same way he always had, with quiet strength, with the loyalty of the dog at his side, and with the knowledge that some fights are won in silence. And in that silence he found peace. The last snow of the season fell that morning, thick and soft. The world hushed beneath its gentle weight. Jake woke to the soft sound of Bear's breathing and the faint glow of dawn pressing through the curtains. He lay there for a moment, just listening, the quiet a balm to everything that had come before. He rose and pulled on his jacket, his movements steady, deliberate. Bear waited by the door, his tail giving a soft thump against the floor, the quiet heartbeat of the life they shared. Outside, the world was clean and bright, the snow sparkling under the early sun. Jake walked to the Veterans Center that morning, each step a silent echo of every fight he'd carried and every stand he'd taken. He paused in front of the plaque by the door. "Loyalty knows no price," his fingers tracing the words carved into the wood. He didn't need a sign to remind him, but he liked the way it felt to see it there. A promise, a quiet stand that would outlive any argument or headline. Inside, the center was warm, the laughter of old friends filling the air. Rachel waved at him from behind the counter, her eyes bright with welcome. Jack was in the back, working with a young veteran and his new service dog, the low murmur of his voice weaving through the quiet. Everything felt right. Not perfect, never perfect, but real and good in the way that mattered most. Tom came over, clapping a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Glad you're here," he said. "We've got a new group coming in today. Thought you might sit in." Jake nodded. "Of course," he said. He didn't need to ask what they needed. He knew it was the same thing he'd needed once. To be seen. To be heard. To know that loyalty and kindness weren't something to be charged for or measured out in dollars and cents. He spent the morning in the quiet circle of chairs, listening as young voices stumbled through stories of fear and doubt and slow, patient healing. Bear lay at his feet, his breathing slow and calm, a quiet reassurance that sometimes just being there was enough. Afterwards, as the group drifted out into the soft glow of the winter sun, Jake sat for a moment longer, his hand resting on Bear's head. He thought about the hotel, the cold marble, the sharp edge of indignity in the receptionist's smile. He thought about the way the Marines had stepped in, 7 minutes that had said more than 1,000 words. And he thought about how that one quiet act, refusing to pay for Bear, had become something bigger than either of them. Outside, he walked home in the hush of melting snow, Bear's leash loose in his hand. The city was waking up around him, the low hum of traffic, the bright shout of children's laughter. But he moved through it all like a stone in a river, the calm in the quiet current. At home, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, the soft light painting everything in gold. Bear curled up beside him, his head resting on Jake's knee, the weight of him a steady, solid thing that spoke of everything words never could. Jake let out a long breath, his eyes drifting out to the street where the snow was turning to water, carrying winter away. He didn't know what would come next. None of them ever did. But he knew he would meet it with the same quiet strength that had carried him this far. With the knowledge that loyalty wasn't something you could put a price on. It was something you lived, something you carried. And as he sat there in the soft hush of the morning, his hand resting on Bear's warm fur, Jake realized something simple and true. The world would keep turning, and he would keep moving. And whatever came next, he was ready, because he had already won the fight that mattered most. Thank you for joining us for this story. If it touched you, if it made you believe in the quiet power of loyalty and the small acts that echo forever, please subscribe to Touching Stories. Like and share this video because sometimes the strongest stand is the quiet one.